Welcome to another episode of Safe Space, the podcast for next generation family business leaders. Today we're joined by Brad Scott out of Brisbane, Australia. Brad, welcome to the show, mate.
Thank you, Franco. Pleasure to be here as usual.
So before we get started, Brad, if you could introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about you, about your company, EWM Group, and then we'll get into the show.
Sure. So 20 years of running EWM Group since we founded this business in 2005, which has been an interesting journey itself. Prior to that, 20 years corporate life around sort of finance, investment, ultra high net wealth, banking, Goldman Sachs, JB Weir, sort of running a lot of their private wealth management business initially, and then sort of set up EWM Group, as I said, in 2005. So it's been an interesting 20 odd years in that space, Franco.
So let's talk about, what was the emphasis, what was the catalyst for you wanted to set up your own firm? What need did you see that you wanted to fulfill with your services?
Yeah, look, like a lot of people's stories, I mean, these things sort of evolve, right? Through opportunity, you see opportunities, you sort of be able to react to those opportunities over time. And as I said, I was 20 years corporate life, and at Goldman Sachs, sort of running their private wealth management business, or at least for Queensland, and we were sort of just developing that business, and that business was relatively new at the time. And, in hindsight, I guess I look back and I was really sort of evolving a business that, if we look back at it now, it sort of was a family office or a multi-family office platform. But, you were never going to be able to do that inside a big organization like that just through the independence or the lack thereof. So I was really sort of starting to form that, and I'd been doing a bit of research in the space as to what best practice had been out of the US and out of Europe, and then it was really quite coincidental that some of those opportunities happened, because one of our family groups that it was actually our first family group that when I set up the private wealth management business, and then they were a great relationship to us. He reached out one day and said, "Scotty, I need some help around all of my world." And he said, we deal with you on some of the investment stuff, but he said, that we want to be able to access other service providers and other opportunities. We're going to need some help around sort of family governance and transition and preparing the next generation for their roles and responsibilities. They wanted some help around their philanthropy and starting to look to set up a foundation and drive all of that piece. But they said we didn't want to do it ourselves. They wanted someone independent, trusted, who can help oversee and facilitate that whole process. But they also didn't necessarily want to go down what we now know as the single family office route and sort of start employing and engaging a whole lot of people just for them. So they were looking for a really economical structure. And the reality, Franco, is that 20 years ago, a multi-family office didn't exist in Australia. So there was obviously a number of single family offices, and the wealth management industry was broad, but a truly independent multi-family office didn't really exist. So it was really that conversation that we sat down and planned it out. And I said, well, look, let's set up a multifamily office. As I said, I'd been doing the research of what that looked like from an American context. And we sort of took the view that we were about 20 years behind the US. That was sort of the rough guideline that where we thought we sat, as far as the evolution of a multifamily office industry is concerned. So that was really how it all started. We started with that one single client. They became the founding client for the business. We really spent the next probably 6 or 8 months just looking after them, setting up systems, processes, licensing, all of those sorts of things. And then we knew that there was a number of other family groups who, within my network, who had said, look, when we're ready, can you let us know that that you're ready to go, and we'll come across, because again, we want someone independent to help drive that. So that was really the nexus, and so, as I said, we started with the one family group back then, and it sort of grew pretty consistently, and we sort of kept a bit of a lid on it up until about GFC, which was a really interesting time for us, and then it really sort of accelerated after that. But the really interesting part of that was that it accelerated from a family context and about the emphasis on family as opposed to wealth. And that was a really key difference, I thought.
So 20 years goes by in a wink, doesn't it?
I had a lot more hair then, Franco.
I was taller. So, so, so what are the key lessons you've learned over this 20 years? How have things evolved from '05 to now?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. In fact, I've just been reflecting on that. When you hit a milestone like we have, it's a great opportunity to reflect. And some of the things that I've reflected on, and I think about, our clients are all entrepreneurial families and individuals who have built wonderful businesses all around the world, and a lot of the comments that I hear from them over the time is you don't learn much from your successes, but you learn a lot from failures and where things didn't go to plan. And that was really true for us. I mean, if I look back now over the 20 years of what has been the really important pivot moments for us as a business, it's been around where things got a bit challenging, or we'd sort of thought we'd go down a particular path and that didn't quite work the way that we wanted to work. So we pivoted around that. I mean, I alluded to it before. GFC was a really interesting point in the industry more broadly, but it was a critical point as far as our business and our business model. Because leading up to GFC, everyone, had a wealth manager. Everyone was making money. Every Tom, Dick, or Harry could generate a reasonable return. But when things went pear-shaped and when the markets turned, the big difference was about having that independent set of eyes and ears who were in a high level of communication, who were educating and helping their clients navigate through those challenging times. And what we found in the traditional industry is that the advisor went to ground. It was great when things were going up, but they weren't talking much when things weren't going well. So that whole importance around independence became really critical, and that's been the backbone to our business for ever since it started. The independent piece, working with their existing team, and then complementing that by sourcing best of breed, and their focus on absolute confidentiality discretion has been the really key points. But so the GFC piece was interesting. We just things like culture critical. I mean, we've had a couple of false starts of sort of the type of people that we'd hire in the organization. But, that's just critical. Just great people who buy into your culture, buy into your values, buy into where you're wanting to drive the business. It makes the journey so much more effective, so much more successful and enjoyable for all. That's been a key part. And we've always had a really good focus on making sure that, the clientele that we come on board there's an alignment. There's a good relationship. Everything we do is about relationships. So there's sort of been some of the really key things I think that have sort of guided our last 20 years.
Okay, so let's talk about the future.
Mm.
The family office business in Australia has evolved over the last 20 years. Where do you see it evolving? Because over the next 20 years, we're going to see massive transitions of wealth,
Yeah, we are.
right? And that wealth is going to have an emotional tsunami attached to it.
Mm.
So how is your group, how are other multifamily offices preparing to manage the emotional challenges coming with a massive wealth transfer over the next 20 years?
Yeah, look, that whole wealth transfer piece is obviously a hot topic, and everybody is talking about it domestically and internationally. However, there's still, I think, very few people who are putting in place systems, process, and guidance to actually deal with it. And everyone's doing it in slightly different ways, right? So for us, education's always been a key component about what it is that we do. So in 2017, we set up a division within the group called the Institute for Family Wealth. And that was really focused about education. So it does two things. One, it educates families on dealing with the emotional challenges of succession, transition, and giving them the tools and the information to help them navigate that space. But we run training programs specifically for advisors to lift the bar of the industry, for them to change their perception to be more of that trusted advisor and to engage in the broader family group. So education is going to be critical in that space. For us as a group, we've continued to grow and expand. We've got clients all around the country and overseas. So we've got an office in Sydney where we've got clients all around the country and, as I said, overseas. So we're looking at adding more people and resources and different locations. So that's continuing to grow. One of the big changes, I think, is going to be the transition of wealth to the next generation, as you correctly pointed out. But as part of that transition, going from one spouse to the next spouse. So I think some of the numbers that we're seeing, it's like 2/3 of the nation's wealth, or 2/3 of wealth globally, is going to be in the hands and controlled by women over the next sort of 10 to 15 years. And rightly or wrongly, the industry has not been very good in looking after both male and female clients. So we set up a division within the group specifically focused on family office services for women of wealth. So that's sort of a bit of a next wave that we'll continue to grow and build on, where, whilst the services aren't necessarily different, the drivers and perspectives and what's really important is a little bit different. So we're making sure that we've got the resources and the people in order to do that well. We set up a division specifically for athletes and entertainers, and that's been a really interesting space. I mean, it was part of our original DNA. Our very first client is a well-known athlete. So, so from the perspective of that being our history, that's continued to grow, and that will continue to expand. So between that, women of wealth, the transition piece, that family governance area is going to be critical. The work that you do, that we do around that space, is just going to be so important in helping families navigate the emotional challenges of wealth. And I know that's a word that some people don't find comfortable. Some do, some don't, and it's often misunderstood. So that's where that whole education piece comes in. So I think that's going to be a really big driver over the next period of time. And yeah, I think they're the probably key points.
We're just in the process of, we're about to release the findings of a really interesting piece of research that we conducted around emotional preparedness, right? And one of the things that we found is there is a massive disconnection between the current generation wealth holder and the next generation wealth holder, particularly around how they see preparedness.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that we asked the groups was, do you believe your current set of governance, does it address and manage the family dynamics and emotional challenges? And about 80% said no.
Yeah.
So where do you see the family office space moving towards helping families deal with the emotional challenges associated with transition, wealth, and family dynamics?
I think it's got to be probably the most important role that the family office has to play. So many people in the industry tend to focus on the investment side. The investment piece is it's a commoditized service offering in many cases. But the family office's role is to sort of oversee that, make sure they're accessing best of breed, clear strategy and policy in line with what they're wanting to do, but in line with the family plan and where the family wants to go with this, and then making sure that the right people are in place to help do that. From the emotional perspective, however, that's the really critical part that the family office needs to be able to play. So they need to be able to make sure that the family, do they have a family charter or a constitution? Are they following the family charter and constitution? Is there a really strong process for communication amongst the family group? What's the education process and systems that are in place within the family to help and aid that preparedness? Is that preparedness attached to a family business, or is that preparedness just about transition of wealth and their role as a steward of that wealth? So, so much of the work that we see, are both from families who are still in their operating business, but then so many of them who have had a liquidity event or partial liquidity event. So you've got family members with next generations with so many different roles, responsibilities, some closely connected to the wealth and the business, some so far removed. But all of them have a role, and all of them need to be prepared for whatever that role is going to look like. So the family office has to play a critical role in doing that. And if it's not doing that, it's an ineffective family office from my perspective.
So, when we look at families of wealth, we've got these emotional challenges, and, as we tell a lot of our clients, when you're the founder, the decision rests on you. You trust yourself, you respect your decisions, and you execute. They may have a board of advisors that you can rely on as a, another set of ears and eyes. But when you are a sibling partnership or cousin consortium, respect, trust, and inclusion becomes a lot more difficult to manage.
Mm,
So, how do you think family offices moving forward are going to help those groups really develop the communication skills in order to be able to respect, trust, and include each other in decision making?
mm. Look, as I said, I think the 2 points that I keep coming back to are communication and education. So the family office has to be that link between the generations in many cases, because you're sitting back with an older generation who, and I say older generation, that could be any sort
Sure.
of age bracket, right? And usually it's quite broad. Um, but they will have their view and perspective of what the future holds and what they think the children
Sure.
should or shouldn't know as far as their preparedness. The next generation, however, are thinking something completely different in many cases. And they're saying, well, we want to be able to get more of an understanding about different parts of the business or the wealth or otherwise. And often there is a big age gap within each generation. So the family office has to play that role in making sure there is consistency in communication from one generation to the next and also within generations. So everyone within the family is being treated evenly and consistently. And then the education piece around whatever the future looks like, whether it's about education and exposure to parts of the family's operating business, whether it be education and exposure around what the family's other interests might be, whether it be just understanding best practice of what other like-minded families have dealt with and navigated over the years. All of those things are going to come into play. And we see a lot of that where we sort of try and help them understand by linking all of those things together, engaging in examples and sharing experience with other like-minded families who have either gone through or are going through a similar sort of process. So the preparedness is a huge piece, and look, you will have heard the stats as well, but that 70% failure rate from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, and 95% of that comes down to four things: trust, communication, purpose, and readiness of the next generation. And that readiness of the next generations is a big part.
So we're coming to the top of the hour, as I'm top of the show, as I knew we would. So I always like to ask our guests the same question. So based on your e- experience, knowledge, and wisdom, Brad, what's one piece of advice you can offer the current generation? And what's one piece of advice you can offer the next generation?
So I wouldn't necessarily say they're different pieces of advice. Um, it's often about perspective, and for each generation to take the time and understand the other generation's perspective in this. Some very wise men over the years, Franco, have talked about each family member's truth and what they consider to be their truth. And their truth is their truth. That's not necessarily going to change. But that might be of one particular event where different family members have taken a completely different perspective of that same event. So a lot of it is about that, understanding each other's perspective and showing some empathy to do that will really help bridge some of those gaps. We often sort of talk about in this journey, mum and dad's plan is not the family's plan. Um, because and I don't know
That's
how
a good
many
one. I like
times
that.
over the years where we've spoken to mum or dad and they've said, hey, listen, we want to prepare the kids. I need you to tell them this, 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 and this. And that's not necessarily going to work, because what mum and dad are thinking they might want to do has not necessarily been communicated. And I can think of a great story over the years where the parents had sort of thought, this is exactly what we want to do, and by the time that was explained to the kids' response was basically, hell no, that is not going to work. We are not going to be prepared to do that. So there was this same outcome, and it had never been communicated, but they needed to come together to determine their path forward and the purpose of what it was that they're trying to do. So it was very much about getting each of them to understand each other's perspective on that, and then coming together to form that common goal, purpose, or outcome. So that's sort of one of the key things that we often talk about from either generation. It's taking the time to understand the perspective and how to communicate within each other. That's critical, and all different generations have their way that they want to communicate, how they communicate, the style they communicate, and as much as some people might want to brush it, it's an important piece you need to take into consideration.
So there you go. Perspective is the words of wisdom from Brad. So Brad, if people wanted to reach out to you, learn about your firm and what you guys do, how do they find you?
So www.ewmgroup.com.au is our website. So that information is there. We've also got the Institute for Family Wealth piece that's attached as well. So, but the website pretty much has everything about our group and our firm, where we've been and what we're going. And I'm also on LinkedIn. So I encourage people to reach out and say hello.
So there you go, folks. Brad, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate your wisdom and your generosity and sharing your experience and where things are going.
Thanks, Franco. Always a pleasure to chat, mate.
So, folks, as you know, our guests donate their time generously, their wisdom, and their expertise for you, because we created this podcast as a form of a community, because we recognize that being part of a next gen as a family business is a lonely place. And I wanted to create this community for you to just feel that you're a part of, that you belong. So if anything that Brad spoke about today or resonate with you, please reach out, let us know. But most importantly, share. Share the wisdom with your peers and friends. That way they too can feel a part of the community. Brad, thank you so much for being on the show.
Cheers, mate. Good to see you.